Good afternoon, and welcome from the Sheen Center in New York to the Core of Our Humanity, a conversation about the theme of this year's encounter. A special thanks to En Route Foundation for helping to organize this event. I'm Suzanne Fields, and on behalf of the New York Encounter, I am honored to introduce Professor Paolo Carozza, who will join us online and will interview our very special guest, Professor Charles Taylor. Paolo Carozza is the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies and professor of law and concurrent professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. With expertise in comparative constitutional law, human rights, law and development, and international law, he focuses his research on Latin America, Western Europe, and international themes more broadly. Charles Taylor is professor emeritus in the Department of Philosophy at McGill University and one of the most influential thinkers within contemporary culture. He has authored many books, including Sources of the Self, The Ethics of Authenticity, and A Secular Age. He has received many honors, including the Templeton Prize, the Ratzinger Prize, and a membership in the Order of Canada. You can find their full bios on our website, newyorkencounter.org. Professor Carozza.
Thank you very much, Susan. And Charles, welcome to the New York Encounter. It's a real privilege for us to have you here for this dialogue and for me personally to be able to engage you in a conversation about the theme of the New York Encounter. As you've seen, the Encounter this year looks at the year 2020 as one, frankly, of crisis in the original sense of that word, as a moment of decision or a decisive turning point, and asks us, what is in it that we need to embrace and hold on to? And that question, I believe, puts us squarely in front of your life's work. I can say that over the decades that so many of us have followed you through your writings, one of the most compelling things that we've found there is your capacity to embrace with great openness and without fear many of the central features of the reality that we're living in modern times, whether it's secularism or the emphasis on self and authenticity and identity or the pluralism of our societies, for example. You've seen in them possibilities for beauty and goodness and for a growth of our humanity and not simply something to withdraw from. So with that spirit in mind for the encounter, I thought maybe we would begin with one thing that has been really a lifelong theme of your work, and that is the integral relationship between community and the individual or individual identity, belonging as a condition of freedom and flourishing rather than as a limitation or contradiction of the self. And I can't help but notice that in these months of COVID pandemic, with respect to the way that we've lived community, there seems to be a sort of paradox around us. In some ways, maybe we've never in our lifetimes experienced so concretely an awareness of our interdependence with one another, who our neighbors are and who the essential workers are that surround us. At the same time, we've witnessed a degree of lived forms of severe social isolation, the absence of bonds and absence of forms of communal living, of education, of worship, that have very stark and brutal consequences on our day-to-day life, from the education of the young to economic well-being and mental health. So What do you make of this paradox, looking at this relationship of ourselves to the community that we live in, and how should we understand the effects and meaning of the pandemic and its aftermath with respect to our life together in community?
Well, I mean, the lessons of it are that there's some things really wrong with our society that we managed to ignore. And we had a society much more, I mean, partly this is to do with politics and a certain kind of politics of laissez-faire or neoliberalism, but we had a society which was much more concerned with increasing production of goods for individual use, right, at the expense of creating the conditions for living together in health care, in education, in the whole sphere, in the care of the elderly and so on. So that this kind of these wrong priorities were revealed in a catastrophic and dramatic way by the pandemic, where the deaths occurred were in the areas where there was great inequality or where there were inadequate health care provision, inadequate provision for the old, and so on. It was a real wake-up call. And on one level, we, in general, reacted with a real sense of solidarity. I remember at the beginning, in a number of countries, people would go out in the streets and sing songs to the healthcare workers and express great gratitude and so on. But it's also been, as you say, terribly trying for some people, just awful. Economically, in terms of their life, getting the means for life, but also in terms of their relationship to their family and so on. And so there's been this struggle between maintaining the sense of solidarity and breaking out of the disciplines, in various other ways, because one can't really stand it. But I think, talking about your country, the United States, but not only, there's a way in which that solidarity side really, I think, in a certain way became extremely important and continued to be. And I'm thinking of the tremendous movement around the murder of George Floyd, which is an extraordinary movement because, of course, Black Lives Matter reacted, and quite rightly, to that. But it's also a moment when people felt a need to liberate themselves from all sorts of exclusions and inequalities and discriminations. And this is even more remarkable, not just in the United States, but I would say throughout much of the world. So there was an outburst of a real sense of solidarity many, many months into the terrible pandemic, right? But nevertheless, still there. So that I think that reaction may be something that we can carry through the whole thing and re-enter so-called normal life with a quite different attitude.
Yes. Thank you. Well, some of that expression of solidarity that we've seen in recent times, not just through the pandemic, but one could say in the last few years in a marked way increasing, might also be characterized as a certain form of collectivism that you've been critical of, also of tribes and the polarization of our political life into expressions of nationalistic exclusion, for example, or reducing the determinants of who we are solely to questions of race or ethnicity or sexuality. So how do we keep the balance between this relationship of the self and the community and the appreciation for freedom that modernity has given us and that you've celebrated in your work, and not reducing the question of our humanity simply to the tribes and groups that we belong to? How can we take both belonging and self seriously?
Well, I think because one of the really important institutions, if you want to call it that, or communities or action together, which does dominate our scene, is the creation and sustaining of democratic citizen republics, if you like. And they demand a certain ethic, which, if you follow it, really leads to kinds of, if you like, fulfillment and new creations for human beings, which have been always there in potential in history, which are now being brought out and made real. I mean, we're really working in good faith with other people to decide things together with a sense that what we're looking at is the common good, not just my good, but the common good, if you can rise to that, you liberate yourself from a totally narrow focus on your own advantage, on your own particular narrow gang, and something emerges, which is, I think, a tremendously important human development. So it's that, and I think that's what everybody sees in these battles over the identity of political societies throughout I was going to say Western world, but not only the Western world, right? That on one hand, there are people who have appealed to some of these narrow identities against others, and it's really an appeal of what Nietzsche called ressentiment, I mean, of really resentment, you might say. And on the other side is an appeal to rise to the occasion of being able to work with others in an open way we're characterized by mutual concern and listening to the other and so on, which really liberates something in us. And it liberates our capacity to listen to others, our capacity to work with others, our capacity to create something together, which is really morally admirable. And I think in that sense, that's why I think there's going to be some continued consequences from our reaction to this pandemic, because this issue, do we have the capacity to create the kind of solidarity which can really work for the common good, or are we going to be locked into our mutual distrust and mutual contempt? I mean, and I'm speaking at this point to both sides, right? Because, I'm very much on the so-called liberal side, obviously. And I'm horrified by the Trump presidency and so relieved that it's over and so on. But I can't help thinking that a lot of people on, as it were, our side just talked about these yokels, narrow, illiberal, ignorant people and so on, without any attempt to understand what they were actually living, what their ambitions were, what the human side of their lives was. And so this is a challenge to us as well as to them to reach out and have a capacity to understand what's really going on in the people that we most must collaborate closely with, our fellow citizens.
Mm-hmm. So if the social bonds that you mention and that kind of sympathy and awareness of our fellow citizens is so essential to shoring up democracy and especially in a pluralistic society, which you've thought about so much, how do we generate and maintain those social bonds, in particular, given some of the trends that we've seen towards, let's say, emotivism, scapegoating, a sort of collective mob mentality that's fed certainly by social media as well. How can we respond to that and still construct a sense of solidarity and belonging to one another that you see as so essential?
Well, I think there are two sides to the path beyond that to something richer. Number one, which is kind of obvious, is that there are all sorts of even common interests which bring together objectively people on both sides of this divide. If you take, again, U.S. politics, a lot of the people in the Midwest that voted for Trump because they live in Rust Belts, they're looking for new jobs, new development, and so on, and we're not going to get that from Trump. Right? So, but I can understand how, having made the mistake, they threw themselves into it. So there's a way in which you can reach out on the pure basis of, listen, we have a very important common interest here. We want to reconstruct America in a way which will deal with global warming. That's going to mean a sort of stimulus and investment, and we can create jobs, etc. That's one level. On the other level, the level where you have to liberate someone from their deep investment in contempt and difference from the other, there is a much more powerful common interest, but at a very, very deep level, that these stances in life are really crush something in us which could possibly be immensely creative. This is what I found just wonderful by the leadership you've had in the United States of the African American movement, from Martin Luther King to John Lewis. John Lewis kept saying this wonderful thing: put down the burden of hatred. And hatred is a burden. It's dragging you down, right? It's dragging you into a narrow little cell where you can't really, certain side of you can't flourish. And so, on another very deep level, there's a very profound common interest in both sides getting out of their definition of themselves purely in opposition to someone else, right? Whether it's liberals thinking these yokels out there, or people in the Midwest thinking these, what is it, latte sipping Eastern liberals and so on. There's something funny about this ridiculous business, but there's something also tragic, and it's there's a real liberation to be had. And that's what I find remarkable about some of those demonstrations after George Floyd, that you've got all these young people, they sensed that there was something self-liberating in this, right? Together with others. And it's that very deep insight, which, not everybody in politics has, but people like Gandhi and King and so on really lived by.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how much that connects quite directly to even the title that the New York Encounter has taken on this year, about reality striking us when reality hits, right? Because your description sounds to me like saying, in a certain sense, those sort of ways of thinking that are ingrained in us that separate us from others can be broken down by a relationship with the reality as it strikes us, right? Whether it's an event like the death of George Floyd, or simply getting to know someone else, the encounter with another person, things that draw us out of ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
But if so, then that leads me then to another question, which is also, occupied so much of your work, and that's the question of, how human beings, and especially sort of the self as it's conceived in modernity, is a being that is interpreting of itself, right? Human beings as self-interpreting animals is how you've described it. And I think some of us might hear that and think, well, that's a recipe for subjectivity and isolation, because it just closes us in on ourselves if we're interpreting ourselves without any relationship to the reality outside of us. So in light of what you just said about sort of an encounter with reality drawing us out, how does that fit with your understanding of human beings as essentially constituted by their capacity to interpret meaning themselves?
Well, I mean, it's on two levels, because one reason to talk about self-interpreting animals is just look at history or politics, and you see how very different cultures have a very different way of realizing the human potential. So in some way, although there hasn't been a conscious act of interpretation here, the interpretations have arisen in history of what it is to be human and so on. And then we have to have anthropology and sociology and so on to help us understand from very different people. But I think what you're referring to more specifically is the development of a modern forms of individualism, in which people are called upon to discover their own, if you like, their own vocation, what they really can do, what is specific to themselves. And this is not necessarily a recipe for enclosing yourself in your own references. In two ways. In one way, you never work it out with yourself without dialogue or exchange with others. Can be close others, can be more distant others. But also, if you are still in contact with reality, you discover that, your way of being, your vocation, is something which involves relating to others in all sorts of different ways. And, the doctor who's been very successful, made a lot of money, but then decides this is not enough in life, so he goes to Médecins Sans Frontières, or the Doctors Without Borders. But this is a person discovering herself or himself, right? That's what they're doing. It's a classic example of the ethic of authenticity. What am I really in this world for? What do I want to do? But it's absolutely the opposite of self-absorption, right? Because you're going to go out to some very foreign country and meet a very different culture and learn really to serve these people. And it drives you outward. See, so there's no necessary connection. Now, this all can turn. People can deny that kind of reality, deny those kind of needs, and getting close to themselves. And that's what we've seen a lot of in our society, which has sort of supposedly based on a kind of meritocracy and appeals to you to develop yourself as an individual, and looks on people who aren't successful as it's all their fault because they haven't been working. And so on, that kind of, I think, very bad ideology, which is really self-delusive ideology, because people who are successful never did it all themselves. So it can turn that way, but it's not, as it were, the consequence of the ethic of authenticity. It's a consequence of very false choices in the dimension of authenticity.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Thank you. I see that that way of looking at how we live the ethics of authenticity dovetails really very well into what has been some of the most influential and magisterial work that you've done for us, which is thinking about the meaning and implications of secularism and the secular age, right? The way, in other words, that given what you just said, that the secularism, the secular age in which we're living in important ways opens us up to new possibilities, rather than being something that we need to react to, least of all out of a certain fear or withdrawal. But rather it's an opportunity, in the way that, for example, it has interrupted certain very contingently, culturally contingent forms of religion that might have become ossified over times and rigid, or the way that it's brought us, those of us who are Christians at least, back to an appreciation for the nature of Christianity, essentially as an event and not as an ethical construct or a political project or a set of norms or a set of pieties. And that kind of openness to the secular age has been something that has, I think, for many of us from the time that we read your book, has been very inspiring in terms of relating to the world. Now, that was written, a long enough time ago now that we've seen in the years since then a continued very sharp rise in secularism, not only in the United States, but in particular here. And arguably also a variety of, shall we call them, social pathologies that are associated with the absence of a belief in anything transcendent. So, the increasing triumph of technocracy, of a certain, very false kind of meritocracy that you were referring to earlier. Things like what Pope Francis refers to as the throwaway culture or the globalization of indifference are arguably all sort of manifestations of an increasingly not only expansive but sharp and uncompromising secular world. So, I mean, it leads me to wonder how you've thought about the movement towards a secular environment in the years since you wrote that book, and do you think about it any differently today than you did then?
No, I mean, it's the same, only more so. I mean, it seems to me clear that there is a kind of moral evolution going on in history. Theologically, I would talk about something like St. Irenaeus' idea that God is exercising a certain pedagogy in history, right? And I think you can point right back to the axial period as an example of that, where in quite different civilizations out of contact with each other, the idea of the universal becomes central. Well, I think that's something that has been going on. I mean, let me give you one striking fact that we all know, but we haven't really thought of. For centuries, Christians and Stoics and a lot of other people thought that, well, slavery is really a rather uncomfortable thing, but it's part of the world, it's part of the reality. So the injunction was to, treat your slaves humanely, Paul says, recognize them as fellow Christian and so on. In the 18th century, we arrive at a moment in which tremendously powerful movements arise saying, no, this is just not acceptable. Abolitionists. Now, people talk about the Enlightenment, a lot of secular people talk about the Enlightenment, and by which they mean some kind of very secularized Enlightenment thinking purely. But of course, that movement was, in the English-speaking world, it was evangelicals that were really exercised by that. I'm not exclusive. If you look over the whole of Europe, but the real driving force of abolitionism in the States, for instance, was a certain kind of really Protestant theology, right? So we're talking about something, this kind of thing, where does it come from? I mean, why has it come about, right? Is it simply because people rationally thought, we're thinking all humans are human, so oh, gee, there's a entailment of that. No. That's, that was just as easily possible to draw the conclusion before. But something is happening in history. And this is something we have to look at as part of a total pattern of change, which includes other things like another extraordinary thing about our lives today as against 500 years ago is we have this incredible sense of control and a reality of control over our kind of society. Just think of the organization that we're now trying to put up to, vaccinate everyone and make people obey rules and so on. That kind of control didn't exist earlier. Not to talk about the control over external nature. And we're about to do something catastrophically dangerous because of that, right? So that's part of it. And that's also part of a climate in which earlier kinds of relations to religion and spirituality, which thought of God as micromanaging the world and getting mad if we don't do the right things and bringing up, right, has just disappeared from the scene. So put all this together and you're in a quite new situation where you have to, as it were, develop your spiritual sensibility to get an orientation of what's going on. And so you get these remarkable people that, I'm thinking of John Maine, who introduced Christian meditation, which I follow, but I mean, a lot of others as well. New ways of acting, of bringing the spirit into the world again, making it active and alive. And, we have no choice. That's the way forward. You can't possibly get back to what existed before. It's just really, the mold is broken. So instead of sitting around and saying, oh, it's terrible, we're losing all these things, we have to hang on as much as we can, we need this kind of action of, if you like, spiritual exploration, spiritual discovery.
Yeah.
And reading the gospel anew, finding new, Francis is a great example of that. He says that the church is not a kind of huge organized society, it's a field hospital. That's a really striking image, right? A really striking image. You couldn't have, imagine convincing Innocent the Third or these guys in the Middle Ages. It's a field hospital. What do you mean?
Right.
Or Pio, no.
Yeah. Well, that opens up so many other questions, Charles. Let me go to one end, maybe the most intimate end of the things that first come to mind to me, and that is to speak as a parent, as well as an educator, right, a lifelong educator. In the environment that you describe, what do those of us who are educators of our children and our students need to do to equip young people to live in that world that you describe in a way that is still authentic and open to the transcendent and generative of the new forms of life that you're calling us to? Well, how do we transmit that?
Well, you make available as much as you can to your students or your kids. You make available as much as you can examples of this really creative exploration of these new departures and so on, and hope that something catches on. Yeah. As against presenting the faith that here are a set of rules and don't step outside them and terrible consequences will occur, which for a lot of people just dead wood, as it were. You, on the contrary, can, as an educator, the most wonderful thing you can do is communicate And the wonderful thing I've had in my education is people who can communicate. In the undergraduate, I did history, but I needed some electives. So I looked around. There was a comparative religion. That's interesting. So I went to this guy, and it turned out to be Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who is later the founder of the Islamic Institute at McGill and then at Harvard, and so, right. And this man walked up and down with a gown, and he made real for us what it would be like to belong to these other religious faiths, mainly Islam, because that was what he really knew, but Buddhism and so on. And I was just absolutely carried away. This is a way of living in the world, a way of being. He was a Christian, a way of exercising spirituality in the world, which would just take us in a completely different direction. Right?
Yeah. In describing that before, I've noticed in reading how you've described that before, I've noticed that you have simultaneously emphasized the central importance of interreligious encounters and dialogue, as you just did right now in your comments. And yet, at the same time, you've been very clear to say that doesn't mean a syncretism. That doesn't mean a lack of distinctiveness among the religions in what each one is bringing into the world. Could you explain that a little bit, how those two things fit together for you and how we should think about that relationship?
Yeah. I mean, if you think of religion simply as a set of propositions, then obviously the ones of Buddhism and the ones of Christianity, they don't mesh, right? But if you think of a faith as a path or an ensemble of possible paths of spiritual development, then you can't just have something which is a kind of mix. I mean, the Dalai Lama said it wonderfully at a meeting I was at once. He said, you can't put a sheep's head on a yak's body. If you're a Christian, how are you trying to go further along in this faith? By kind of prayer, in my case, kind of meditation, which is like prayer, in which you're trying to reach that extraordinary love of God through Christ and the way it can transform you and pass on. It's not the same kind of thing as if you're a Buddhist, or the same kind of thing as, and you go on to all these others. So you've got to, or maybe you could make some kind of mix, maybe of some of them, that's possible, but it isn't just a potpourri. It's just, you can't put all these things together as a path. But you can find in people on the other paths, Muslim, Buddhist, and so on, people who are really striving in sort of the same direction, with even great overlap in how they want to realize things in the world. And this is where my political experience has been tremendously important for me, because I discovered myself in coalitions trying to realize something in which here's an atheist, there's a Muslim, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we are, in far as the things of this world are concerned, we're really very closely allied. We're aligned. We're working together. And a great respect grows from that. But it can't produce a kind of empty syncretism in which, you try to put together this kind of prayer and not prayer at all and so on. It just doesn't work. The paths are different, and you have to be in one. But you can really respect people in others. And that's what I got from Will Smith, actually. It's very deeply satisfying thing to develop friendships whereby you learn what makes them, what moves them. And I know it's very hard to explain to people who are locked in looking at it as a set of propositions. Do you accept this theological?
Right.
That's not the way you become a saint. Right? Accepting theological positions, right?
Does this reference that you make to repeatedly to traveling a path or having a journey of growth and an itinerary? Oh. You mentioned it now in a way that refers primarily to an individual's path. Does the same apply to us at a communal level as
Absolutely.
As Christians or as Americans, or what is the social dimension of that itinerary, and how does that get expressed?
Well, in terms of Christians, in terms of Catholics, you need a parish. You need, I mean, a community that you can, and sometimes that's very difficult to find. And what you do find, sociologically, this is again a kind of reality check, what you find sociologically in the Catholic Church is a concatenation of affinity parishes where the lack of affinity between some and others is very, very marked, alas. But people are looking for a parish in which their understanding of what the Christian path is can be shared and sacramentally shared with others, right? Then if you get to the broader scheme of things where we're all citizens together, then the common goals are, I mean, political, social, things of that kind, right? But then if you're really living faith ought to motivate you to enter into some of these general objectives, right? And work as loyal fellow members of the party or members of the movement or whatever, or members of the, organization which is creating some kind of, meeting some kind of need, etc. But so there is a kind of sociability connected to both the path that you're on and the kind of world that you, being on that path, makes you want to create around you.
Yeah. I'm sure that many of us have felt in this year, again, of crisis, of change, of upheavals, that the disruptions that we've witnessed around us and are experiencing in our own lives have a feeling of being an inflection point socially and historically. You've used the term social imaginaries to talk about the way that there's the interrelationship of values and institutions and laws and symbols by which we live and imagine the social whole. Do you think it's right to have an intuition right now that we are witnessing a historical moment where there may be a new social imaginary emerging out of these disruptions?
Yeah, I think so, but I think I want to put a modification in that, because if you look at this history from one point of view that I was talking about earlier, it's a kind of movement forward, like that famous moment in the 18th century when people decided to abolish slavery. But each one of these moves forward has produced not really exactly counter movements. It's produced deviant forms that are sometimes more horrible than anything else. I mean, even Genghis Khan didn't have something as terrible as the Holocaust, or I would say Xi Jinping's sort of attempt to make over the minds of all those Uyghurs in the kind of torture camps there. So there are, but these are just extreme cases, right? But there are less flamboyant cases of evil or wrongdoing, or so we find ourselves in a kind of situation of struggle where it's not that we arrive at a plateau. Okay, there we are. That's fine. That's perfectly okay. Let's go to the next level. I think this is one of the terrible mistakes we make in the democratic world. We repeatedly believe that 1918, we made the world safe for democracy. So then along comes Mussolini, and then we crashed them and we made the world safe for democracy. And along comes the whole issue of decolonization. And then we have in 1989, oh no, we've made the world safe for democracy. And that's a terrible illusion that these, it's not the only lesson you can draw from this whole history. It's not the only way of feeling liberated from this history to build a really open and loyal democracy. And you see in Eastern Europe today, in Poland, that are very close to it for a variety of reasons. We get the kind of people who are in continuity with Solidarność and with what John Paul was for on one hand, and we get the present government of Poland, which has regressed to extremely narrow kind of ethnic Polish nationalism. The Poles have these two great models in their history: the great Commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland, which was in the 17th century the most open and free society in terms of religious difference, and the narrow nationalism that arose understandably under the partition and controlled by Russia and so on. And see, these two are still fighting it out. And there isn't any moment when you really say, oh, so that's it. And we've got to the plateau and
Right.
there's nowhere to go but further up. And so that's not the way it works.
Right. It's a triumphalistic vision of the end of history, or is really...
The end of history, that was poor. That's poor guy. My name, at my age, I keep forgetting names, but Fukuyama, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what role you thought Christianity in particular has to play in this, transition to an always new form of a social imaginary. But I'll sharpen the question a little bit in light of what you just said. I mean, I wonder whether at least one of the things that we Christians have to contribute in this era is precisely the awareness of the fragility of human affairs and the need always to return to the beginnings of things, the sources of things. You've beautifully always emphasized we have to go back to the sources. We have to go back to the sources. We have to go back to the sources. So, what would you make of that? What is the role of Christianity in this time, and what does it have to do with the need in general to return to the sources, to avoid triumphalism, to avoid a sense that history is over, but always in progress, always becoming?
Yeah. Well, I think that you just have to be a little bit self-critical. You have to be able to see the deviations as they're arising, but also you have to be able to recognize that these sources, these very deep sources, for us, I mean, one of them is the New Testament, right? That this life of this man in the Palestine of that time can be drawn on for all sorts of things. But if you see our situation aright, suddenly other things jump out at you. I mean, what jumps out at me, for instance, from the New Testament account, is how this man is constantly learning. He's constantly seeing individuals who are different from the models that have been given. I've never seen such faith in Israel, or the Samaritan woman at the well, and so on. That kind of ability to be open and to look at what people are, even be surprised by it, and to respond to it, that is really what we need today, in spades. As I was saying, this kind of society can only create that solidarity if you have this ability to reach out and look out and see what's there. So here you have a way of living in democracy. And I think, King is a wonderful example, and John Lewis. They were inspired by Christian faith and all this. So you have a way of living in the society which draws on these very deepest, oldest 2,000-year-old sources, but draws something else out of them than, let's say, 100, 200 years ago, people were drawing out of them. And so there's a sense of a perception of what's going wrong today, and going back, and you get immediately a perception of what is there that addresses that, which was not necessarily emphasized by previous preachers, theologians, bishops, and so on. And this is going to go on for as long as the human race goes on.
Yeah, that certainly was the impulse of early Christianity, right? I think from the gospel examples that you mentioned, to think about how St. Paul and his travels to encounter such different cultures and try to dialogue with them on the basis of what was most essentially human, right? Is that the model for what we need to do today as Christians as well? Something like that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's that kind of, but realize that we can't just repeat the letters of Paul. That it requires also a real insight into what's going wrong today. You have to have these two, and they have to somehow come together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the other things that perhaps Christianity distinctively has on offer, let's say, in a world that is dominated by an immanent frame, as you put it, is the sense of what we might call the sacramentality of reality, right? That reality has within it a certain kind of meaning that is beyond what we can put into it by ourselves. And this sort of tangible engagement with all things that are real around us brings to mind a question about your references in a number of your discussions about your own work to an incarnated view of the human person. And, in incarnation, and contrasted that with what you called excarnation. For purposes of our audience, I'll just, one quote that really struck me is you said, "My whole philosophical work really was trying to understand human beings as embodied beings." That's really intriguing for us, I think, and maybe something that we need to dive deeper into as Christians. So could you tell us a little bit more, break open for us, what do you mean by that contrast between incarnation and excarnation, and where does it fit into our reading and our judgment on what's going on around us today in the world?
Well, I think I start off with what sparked that remark, and that is that our moral explorations, our moral positions, our moral insights are often conceived as the result of reason in a rather narrow sense. That, the finding out the results of science, being logical and consistent. So we have, thinkers like Jürgen Habermas that I immensely admire and have enjoyed working with, but their idea is it's very, very simple. You just contradict yourself if you arrogate something to yourself and don't, as it were, open it for the other. And so that is the road to, now this I call excarnate because this is a kind of reasoning, mathematical and logic, which is maximally trying to push our gut feelings and emotions to the side because they're disturbing factors, right? I can't see that you're a human being like me and that you have the same rights because I don't like you, because you're against me, because you're thwarting or whatever, right? But on the contrary, I think this is just not how it works, that what we have are these very powerful, deep gut feelings. And think of this whole point about the universality. And listen to the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. You don't feel, hey, that's logical. No, you were deeply moved by it. And what that requires, another kind of reason, a kind of reason in which you start off from these very powerful feelings and try to make sense of them and discuss with others and see what does make sense and what doesn't. A kind of hermeneutical work, is you use this bit of philosophical jargon, right? And if you go back to the gospel, what it talks about is this Greek verse, like it means feeling in your gut. He felt pity, would say the translation, but compassion, but it's a word derived from your bowels, your gut, right? So that is you see there is someone who is moved, not simply by that part of the reasoning process which maximally must distance itself from gut feeling. On the contrary, it's a gut feeling which limpidly can find its proper outlet, its proper consequences in action. So it's this, the whole human being has all this range of feelings and intuitions and so on. And that's what we need to draw on to be real, good, fulfilled, proper human beings.
Yeah. So that brings to mind how misunderstood we might say the meaning of human desire is around us. I mean, on the one hand, we have a culture that in its sort of eagerness to hawk the latest iPhone to us plays on a kind of diminution of human desires to just playthings and small satisfactions. And on the other hand, we have a certain kind of appeal to to the desires for belonging and so forth that you were referring to before, that then get expressed in ways that can be quite frightening, right? In forms of nationalism, forms of exclusion, forms of hatred. If we see around us this reduction of desire or this corruption of desire, and what you seem to be saying is the real fulfillment of the human being, right? This incarnated, embodied fulfillment depends on taking seriously, really, truly what human beings desire at their core, at the level of their gut, as you put it. How do we do that? How do we cultivate that? How do we hold on to a sense of this desire that truly belongs to an embodied human being, as opposed to its more corrupted or reduced forms that are inculcated on us and on our young people every day?
Yeah. Well, when we have to liberate in ourselves these very deep desires which are moving towards the good. Now, there are examples of perfectly incarnate, not excarnate at all, desires, like, Hitler's fascism. It's appealing to something in us which is very much comes from the body and a sense of dominating and being excited by being in the crowd, and so it's something terrible. So that incarnation or non-excarnation is not the only condition, right? But how do you defeat that? How do you defeat that Hitlerian, or how do you defeat any one of our very divisive goals that are alive in our politics today? You appeal to it, you overcome it by appealing to something else in people. We're talking about John Lewis earlier in King, right? He's appealing to what is crying to come out in them, the power to create something really great and beautiful with other people, because you're working together, realizing your real common needs in mutual respect. There's a kind of wonderful liberation there from the earlier cramping forms of exclusion. So it's not the only condition, and the only way you can stop the fascist movement is by reading Habermas. I'm all for reading Habermas, right? Don't get me wrong, and he's done a bit of stopping of the wrong kind of stuff. So I greatly admire his work in Germany. But if you want to see how to move even beyond that, you have to discover these deep potentialities in human beings, which reveal themselves first and foremost in these very deep gut feelings, and which then needs to be interpreted and brought out, criticized, maybe connected to others. A whole lot of work of the intellect has to go on here.
Yeah.
But that is where the deepest ambitions of humanity in us reside, are discovered.
So you've spent, and you've referred, even in our conversation today, to the importance of your engagement in politics, and your description of this sort of education of desire seems to me extremely relevant to our political life. You were talking about sort of serving with others, constructing something that's for the common good. What has it meant to you personally to be both a philosopher but also someone who's continued beyond academics to be engaged in politics throughout your entire life? What has been the relationship for you of the life of the mind and this engagement in the construction of the common good? How would you describe that?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to describe the beginning point of it. I just have always been very interested in politics, very exercised by politics, very concerned with what's going wrong. So there's some side of me which just can't stay on the sidelines, right? But then, that being said, there's a conflict, because the more time you spend in the study, the more stuff you can write, and the more time you spend out there in the hustings, the less time you spend in the study, right? There's been that kind of conflict. But I found that there's been a marvelous complicity on another level, because you want really to understand why you're doing this. You want to understand how you can convince people who are doing politics of the wrong kind, that it's the wrong kind, and so on. And you're thrown back on reflections of the kind we've been exchanging and kicking around here. So, except for the all-important issue, how much time you have to devote to this and that, right? And you're always short of time, both to do the best political campaigns and the best working out the ideas. That being set aside, and that's a big, big thing to set aside, there is a marvelous complementarity involved in trying to understand, why am I proposing this? Why is this a good idea? Why is it worth fighting for this?
That's, I mean, you're appealing to politics implicitly as a realm in which we seek and give reasons for what we do, reasons to ourselves, and then reasons to persuade others, right, of the merits of something. We have to be sort of realistic and say the politics of the world around us in our countries these days doesn't seem to be very conducive to that kind of exchange of reason that you seem to be pointing to in it. And in fact, we can even be more blunt and say a lot of us see the world of politics as having been reduced entirely to the realm of conflict and ideology and self-interest, and even mendacity has reached levels that in our lifetimes we've not known before. So, do you think it's realistic for us to think of politics becoming again this locus of reason and dialogue that you're appealing to? How would we recapture that and get there?
Well, once again, I'm not proposing, hoping that one can have the total flip over so it'll be the perfect system. Course. But you can see various ways in which, various reasons for why our political life, political world, political structures have become terribly opaque to people. And their opacity is what allows various merchants of, totally phony solutions like Trump to make great headway, and people can be sucked into following them. And there are several elements to this. One is our information system. We seem to be living in silos with people looking at Fox News and other people looking at CNN and MSNBC. And we seem to be living in another kind of division where people get exclusively from social media completely false information. Right? So there are two ways of moving from here to closer to there, not totally there. One is, of course, to improve political organization. And above all, the more we can have real political organization at the local level, that's where people get together, they meet their neighbors, they realize we need this, that, or the other. They learn to trust each other, and they know what they want, and they know what levers to pull, in state and federal government. So that's a very important part of it. With a couple of colleagues, I've written a book on that recently, actually. And the other is more large-scale mobilizations, which you've seen in the States in 2018, et cetera. But that leaves unsolved or unchanged the information split into, and there it's much more complex. But I think there are going to be ways of punishing real, high-level mendacity. I mean, it's very interesting to me that Fox News has recently been sued by companies that make voting machines on the grounds that in purveying this idea, we've systematically flipped over all the Republican votes into Democratic votes. You're telling us that we are, our machines are dishonest. And that's a very interesting analogy, because I can't insult you publicly and get away with it without you're getting back at me, right? But I can destroy the entire atmosphere of the society with impunity at the moment, right? So we need to have some way of bringing some of that, if you like, law. I'm speaking to a lawyer, so probably this is totally nonsense. But the law concerned with defamation, with calumny and whatever the word is.
Defamation.
Right? Defamation, okay. You have to bring the law concerned with defamation somewhere near a law which is interested in truth-telling, not having indefinite lies spewed to the public and so on. Some way of bringing this together. And I know there are all sorts of problems here, and I'm sure that you're much better at solving them than I am. But this is another It's a two-part, it's a two-sided development, a political organization and doing something to cure the information split or truth, the reality split that people are living in our world today.
Charles, thank you. I can't thank you enough for this entire conversation. I really regret that we're out of time. I could go on all day with my curiosity and know how much everybody who's listening would benefit from your judgments on them. But these minutes have been precious, and I'm very, very grateful for your time here with us. Thank you so much. Yeah. Susan, I'll turn it back over to you just to close things here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again to Professor Carozza and to Professor Taylor, and also to the En Route Foundation. At 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we will resume live streaming with the Faith of Father Giussani, the presentation of the exhibit on the Servant of God, Luigi Giussani, with Holly Peterson, Archbishop Christophe Pierre, and Barry Stolman. You can always visit or watch our exhibits anytime in between events at our website, newyorkencounter.org. Thank you.